thanks everyone for joining. We're going to give people a few minutes to come on in. So appreciate you being here early and welcome.
Welcome to the Preparing Your Reopening Plan webinar. I'm Michael Donovan, the Executive Director of the Missouri Arts Council, and this is being presented by the Missouri Art Safety Alliance, a collaboration of over 20 arts organizations in the state of Missouri. This webinar is presented with a technical platform provided by ArtsKC and with technical support for the Kranzberg Arts Foundation. In the last few weeks, we have had 28 organizations certified as Missouri ArtsSafe, and there will probably be hundreds more before this is over. One component of Missouri ArtsSafe program requires the preparation and publication of a COVID-19 safety plan. This process is going to help you jumpstart drafting your plan. Let me introduce our panel of experts. Mandy Stone is the Vice President of Earned Income and Guest Services at Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. Mandy oversees all operations that contribute to earned-in revenue and authored their COVID-19 plan. The museum's art collections and programs inspire creativity and build community for nearly 600,000 guests annually. Carly Love is the operations manager for the Ragtag Film Society, which encompasses True False, a 4-day international documentary film festival, and Ragtag Cinema, a 2-screen art house cinema. Carly used her background as an occupational therapist to make Ragtag more accessible and help create their COVID-19 reopening plans. And Joe Hanrahan is the artistic director of the Midnight Company, which has been presenting theater in St. Louis for over 20 years. Joe served as the marketing director for both the St. Louis Rep and the Black Rep. He has worked with many theater companies as an actor and director, and as playwright, his works have been performed in Brooklyn, Kansas, and St. Louis. So what we ask you to do is hold your questions or put them into the Q&A section of the screen below you, and they'll be answered after we give you a short presentation on how to prepare your plan. So I'm going to start with a question for our panel. How did you begin creating your plan, and what kind of research and input did you get?
I can speak for the Nelson Atkins Museum. We started to create our plan and we felt a little lost. Things were new. Masks, to mask or not to mask was just starting to become a hot topic. We had our city was scrambling to provide guidance. Our state was providing guidance. Our county was providing guidance. And, we were really trying to put it all together and figure out what exactly was going to be right for the museum. some of the most valuable input that we got, in addition to the guidance and the mandates that were coming through, was also through a survey that we did to our staff, volunteers, members, and casual guests, just to really understand what was important to them and what was not important to them, because we had a lot of ideas of what we could do to make things safer, but not all of them were going to be that valuable and could potentially take a lot of time and money to implement. So that was of a lot of value. And then also just our peers within the other arts organizations here in Kansas City, and then of course across the state, really hearing what they were doing and how they were approaching it, so that to the best of our abilities, we could create a consistent experience at museums and other arts organizations.
Here in Columbia, we were given some pretty robust guidelines from our health department when they published plans for our whole city in the reopening phases, which has been really helpful in creating our plans. We also consulted with some plans that have just come through Los Angeles and New York, and a variety of different webinar series through conference planning organizations and the Film Festival Alliance. And then keeping up with CDC updates early on was one of the other ways that informed the decisions that we made and how we created our plan. We also, our local downtown district, did a survey similar to what Mandy's kind of talking about. And we used some of the information from that to kind of understand our expectations of what kinds of individuals would be willing to come back to the cinema and interact with us in an indoor space.
Joe?
My perspective in St. Louis, there may have been guidelines in the city and things, but they were very general and didn't really apply to arts venues. I'm a resident company at the Kranzberg Arts Foundation. I was lucky to be able to follow their guidelines, which started early and has been developing all along. And the other things that really helped me, there's an organization here in St. Louis, I don't know how far it spread statewide, Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts. They published a really voluminous list of early plans from all kinds of organizations, from theaters and galleries and arts foundations in different cities. So I looked at most of those as well.
Well, as we follow up this webinar, we're going to be sharing some of these resources with you, including the one from the Volunteer Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts. So what were three of your most helpful sources of information and guidance as you developed your plan?
The number one most helpful source for us is the CDC, and we still lean heavily on the CDC and their resources, particularly when we have staff members or volunteers who want to challenge a decision or challenge, why we are or aren't doing something. It's very helpful to be able to pull up those guidelines and resources and have that expertise to point to. So peer organizations, of course, is just has been very, very helpful, not just here in Missouri, but to Carly's point, across the country, seeing how our peers are doing things. And then those staff and volunteer priorities that I talked about still weighs heavily too, and helps us to know where to focus.
We also initially leaned pretty heavily on CDC guidelines, as well as the World Health Organization's plan for recommendations for larger gatherings. I am actively employed as a hospital employee, and so I was able to also utilize some of the policies at the hospital to shape how we communicate to our staff and to our patrons about our expectations of staff and our expectations of our patrons. NPR, I'll drop this in the chat, but NPR recently came out with recently, it was like a month ago, but a great etiquette surrounding COVID precautions that we've shared with our staff as well, just as a way to remind them of what customer service could look like right now, to feel more of an educator instead of an enforcer.
And most valuable to me was the Kranzberg guidelines that they had established early and continued to refine. I'm actually targeting trying to do a show there later in the year, and so was The Kranzberg guidelines covered their variety of spaces, small and large venues and art exhibits and many things. So practically they were a great guideline, but many of the resources from volunteer lawyers were also helpful, particularly Actors Equity, which dealt with the production, on stage, backstage, a little bit of the audience. Another place that I found really helpful was the Oklahoma Arts Council guidelines, which dealt with hints and tips for an organization and your staff. Didn't apply to me as much, but they were pretty comprehensive in what they did.
So how did you involve others in the planning process, such as your board, your staff, volunteers, audiences, or visitors?
So our most important planning group, we call them the Emergency Preparedness Task Force. And we started the task force around mid-February when we saw something potentially coming for us and wanted to start planning for what we might have to endure. And there was a time when that task force met daily, and now we're down to twice a week regularly. But it's a cross-functional team from across the organization that represents every department, every team. And we come together and talk about all things related to COVID-19, potential reopening. It's great to have those eyes and ears in all different parts of the organization to bring back feedback or concerns or observations and talk through how to handle those to get to the best decision. We did fairly regular presentations to our leadership team and the board to get input. They were always sharing ideas with us too, that we would share with the task force, but by and large, it was that task force that made most of the decisions.
Between myself and our executive directors team, we came up with our plans. I think we might have run them past our staff. It's been so long to think about the process that we went through. But our board of directors they really trusted us with the process because we had already been in community. Our festival was March 5th through 8th. And so actively before the fest, we were already in pretty direct communication on the daily with our health department. And so our board of directors felt confident in our ability to continue that relationship with the health department. And our contact there has been a wonderful relationship. And so they've basically reviewed our plans and either said, hey, way to go, these are right on track, or here's 2 or 3 changes that you could make. And then from there, our staff has really just through their daily operations kind of chimed in and said, hey, this is working and this isn't. And we've worked to change our language or the way that we're marketing our space and things like that.
And my plan was fairly targeted and specific, aimed at a specific show at a space run by the Kranzbergs, who'd already done a lot of preliminary work on this whole thing. From the beginning, I tried to share everything that they told me with the people that would be working with me on my show. And also I shared it with another smaller space that I had an August show scheduled that had to be rescheduled. But the Kranzberg folks, I submitted my plan to them first and early because we were going to be going together for city approval. They gave me some thoughts and some advice for slight changes, and we did that. And now we're in our final discussion and hopefully going forward with it.
Thanks, Joe. What did you find to be the most challenging part of this process?
For us, the most challenging part was working through all of the ideas that people had for ways that we could keep the institution safe and healthy. Our list, if I remember correctly, it topped about 120 unique ideas from simple things like let's not use the break room refrigerator, because it's a shared handle that we're all touching, to expensive ideas, like let's install infrared thermometers that take our temperatures as we walk in the building. Each one of those things that we were hearing other people do or that we thought might make the institution safer, we had to work through each one of those and decide, what are we actually going to do? How is this practically going to work? Do we have the budget to truly implement this? And so that was the most challenging and time-consuming part. And then being able to communicate back what we were going to do, weren't going to do, and why.
I think after developing our plan seemed fairly easy because of our business guidance from our city and county health department. I'd say the most challenging part has been updating our plans repeatedly as the reopening phases have changed in our community. But one of the things I think we entered early on and now are navigating in a different manner is our staff's kind of fear. And I think, you know, Mandy, the fridge handle is a primary example that our staff was like, well, I can't touch this if someone else has it. And a lot of education of washing our hands, not touching your face, just really public health education just to our staff alone. And now we share a space with a record store and a bakery and bar. And so one of the things we've navigated with them thus far is what happens if somebody has tested positive or is a contact of an exposure or positive test. And in navigating that, I have found we've had to really outline more and more to our staff when they should be concerned about their own health or the health of somebody that they're around, and when they don't need to be. If somebody in the record store is a positive case, they're not in our space, and our staff didn't interact with those individuals at all. This is an example, this has not happened. But for our staff to understand that, hey, you're okay, and we're gonna make it through this, and kind of making them a little more, feel a little more safe and secure and healthy about the integration between all of the businesses in our one building.
Mine probably was less challenging than some others, certainly a museum or some other spaces, because it's one production in a targeted space. But one thing I found challenging in going through the other plans doing research was boiling it down to the simple practical things that I needed to do. Every organization spends a lot of time talking about their philosophy and talking about their commitment to safety, which we all share. And, you know, I kept that fairly simple and really tried to have my plan deal with the strict practicalities of hands-on safety practices before, during, and after a show.
So most of you have already reopened or had some public activity. How did your plan work in practice? Did you have any issues in terms of using the public being involved with your plan?
So our public reopening is September 12th, but we are in our member and volunteer phase right now, where they are coming in as the public or as guests, and they are experiencing the museum as the public will, and giving us feedback. So far, most of our issues have come around ticketing, in that we used to just be a doors open museum, come in anytime, anywhere, completely free. Now we're still free, but we require that you get a timed ticket. They're available online. So there's been a lot of education around kind of the new way to enter the museum and make a reservation of sorts. And then also just some little things like, you know, exactly where the hand sanitizer stations are located, you know, making sure they're close to certain touchable areas. So, but those are the minor changes we've made so far.
Overall, our plan has been going pretty well. If anything, people don't realize that we're open because they still think that movie theaters are closed down. The two major cinemas in our town didn't open back up until I think a week ago. And so some people were under the impression that meant we were closed too. So that's really, if anything, that's been the hard thing, is convincing or marketing and encouraging people to let them know that we're open. One of the biggest things that changed for us, and this was because of part of our plan, was to pivot to outdoor cinema. And we've never done outdoor cinema on a regular basis. And so that was a pretty steep learning curve for us. But our first drive-in movie sold out in 48 hours, which told us very clearly that our audiences and our communities very much are eager to engage with the arts in some capacity. And so it's really challenged us to think through how do we do something that where people feel more healthy and at less risk. And what's been pretty interesting is how have we taken our plan and applied it to our outdoor spaces, and just how different that looks, because our city mandates and our county mandate doesn't say a whole lot about outdoor spaces when it comes to masking. It only talks about social distancing. And for most of our audiences, they feel really safe when everyone around them has a mask on. But unless we give them a 6-foot pole to walk around with, they don't really trust anybody else. MU athletics will be continuing with football season as of right now. They did a really long survey study, and the one line that came out of it that I sort of laughed about, but it said, what do fans fear? And the number one answer was that fans fear other fans. They don't necessarily fear being in the stadium with a lot of people. They're just worried about the other people they're around, not necessarily their own behavior. So tackling outdoor spaces has been our biggest change when it's come to evolving our plan more.
The show I'm planning isn't scheduled till October 29th if it happens. I'm just hoping we can get kind of a go-ahead by mid-September or slightly after. And I think the challenges will be there in terms of simply and clearly communicating to the public that we've made all the preparations we can for their safety. I'm hoping that Carly's right, that the hunger for art will translate into coming to see an indoor play, but I think we're going to be one of the first. So I think there's going to be some challenges on all sides to inform people and make them feel comfortable to come.
Well, I think we all share that hope. One last question for all of you, and very briefly, what is your best tip for someone just starting their plan?
I think the best tip is, while it was tedious to have such a long list of ideas, it really was very helpful to collect those and go through one by one and think about, how would this truly work operationally? How would this truly make us safer? And do that with a group of people and come to the best decision for your organization.
I think the best thing that I could share is to know that you can only control what happens in your own space. As soon as somebody walks out of your space, we don't have, or right before they walk into your space, we don't have the grounds to police them on what they do. And so to be proactive and educational, but to not be forceful or hostile. As we provide more and more education to our audiences, they feel a little more welcome.
And I'd say whatever your plan is addressing, a smaller space, larger space, you understand what those needs and practicalities are, and to deal with those are hard enough to like cover everything and to really be comprehensive about them, and don't worry about doing any large upfront statements about how you're keeping the world safe with this. It's been said and everybody's saying it. So I'd say stay real and stay practical with what your needs are.
I want to thank our panelists for right now. You'll hear from them again when we ask questions. And I'd like to introduce someone who's going to talk to us briefly about legal waivers. James Emanuel is a team of Bryan Cave's product liability practice team. He focuses practices on complex products liability and commercial litigation matters, and has written and spoken about liability waivers as related to COVID-19. He is a St. Louis volunteer, Lawyers and Accountants for the Arts volunteer, and we thank him for that. James?
Thank you very much, Michael. So as Michael said, I'm an attorney at the firm of Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner. I've been researching and writing about COVID-19 liability waivers these past few months, which I'll be speaking about today. What I'll say today is for educational purposes. So I'm not here to give legal advice, but just to give a good lay of the legal landscape to assist you all as you go forward. So And additionally, there is some good guidance on the VLAA website, as well as my firm's website about the legal implications of reopening. My firm website is bclplaw.com. So I'll start off by talking about what is a liability waiver. So it's actually a contract, a legally enforceable contract in most cases between two parties, generally a service provider and a customer, where the customer agrees to give up their right to bring a negligence claim. I'm sure everyone's familiar with these. They've become increasingly common over the past couple decades, usually in connection with recreational activities like, going to a gym or things of that nature. And the reason that they've become increasingly common is because it generally can be an effective way to insulate your organization from liability for negligence. A few caveats. The first is that we are in uncharted waters here. There's no precedent for the situation that we're currently experiencing. I checked today, and I've been monitoring continuously. There's been no court in the United States that has interpreted a COVID-19 liability waiver. That said, we can generally predict that interpretation of a COVID-19 related waiver will be governed by general principles related to liability waivers, which have many years of legal precedence. It's important to note that enforcement of your liability waiver will vary by your jurisdiction. So a waiver that might be enforceable in Missouri could be unenforceable if you operate in Kansas or another state. And additionally, the contours of the waiver can vary by jurisdiction. So for example, some states will allow you to waive liability as it pertains to minor individuals, and other states will not. One thing that's common among all states with respect to liability waivers is that you cannot waive liability pertaining to gross negligence, recklessness, or intentional conduct. So it's incredibly important that you have procedures in place, as we've discussed today, that evidence good organizational conduct. You should be cognizant of the laws and regulations in your jurisdiction, specifically those promulgated by the CDC and other health organizations. Because you can't engage in reckless conduct and expect a waiver to insulate you from liability. We've seen reports. I think a good example of this is some of what we've seen come out of Lake of the Ozarks with bars and other organizations down there. If they were to have a liability waiver, it probably wouldn't be worth the paper it was written on, because they are flouting health regulations. So I'd like to talk about the general requirements of what should go into a liability waiver. And the article that I've written on this topic actually links a form waiver that is a good starting point for organizations to look at. The first requirement for enforceability is the content of your waiver. So it's important that your waiver unmistakably inform the signer of exactly what is being waived. So what does that mean? It should have clear, unmistakable language that an attendee is waiving their right to bring a negligence claim against your organization in connection with COVID-19 exposure, etc. You should specify the risks being waived, and you'll see in our form waiver that we talk about the fact that it's really impossible at times, given the fact of asymptomatic transmission, to fully prevent against what has been shown to be a serious disease or serious illness. And third, your waiver should not attempt to disclaim acts beyond negligence. So you shouldn't, language that would try to insulate you from recklessness or things of that nature would also be unenforceable. Just as important as the actual language in your waiver is the form of it. So if you do choose to employ a waiver, you want to make sure that it's prevalent, that the text is readable, that the font size is large enough that the signer understands exactly, what he or she is waiving, which is a negligence claim against your organization. Additionally, we recommend that certain key terms be bolded, terms such as assumption of the risk and generally waiver of liability, which you'll also see in our form waiver. Also important to enforcement of liability waivers is the manner of signing. So you want to employ a process for signing the waiver that makes it as voluntary as possible. So, one thing that you would want to avoid would be to have someone purchasing a ticket or traveling to your event and then signing a waiver at the door. The reason being because that isn't as free or of a choice as it would be to ensure that the signer is signing the waiver prior to ever coming to your event. So we generally recommend a process where registrants to your event are signing a waiver beforehand, and a process that ensures that a waiver must be signed before the attendee comes to your event. Courts looking at liability waivers will also ask whether the waiver is violative of public policy. And this is a really fact-dependent question, which basically looks to the nature of the activity that you're engaging in. So one thing I'll say that is pertinent to this situation is that a waiver between an employer and an employee is generally not enforceable. So it would, whereas a waiver might work for a conference or event attendee, it would not work for your employees. So in conclusion, I'll say, and I would encourage you to take a look at our article posted online, which speaks to all this in more detail, that while courts have not interpreted COVID-19 liability waivers, we generally recommend them because history has shown that waivers are an effective and cost-efficient way to protect your organization from liability. If you do choose to employ a waiver, it should be clear, it should be unambiguous, and it should be employed in a manner where the attendee is making a free choice to waive any legal rights that they have. And finally, given the variation in jurisdictions with respect to enforceability of waivers, we would recommend that you consult a lawyer to tailor any waiver to your specific activity and jurisdiction. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. We have a couple questions in the queue for James, but if you have a question for James or any of our panelists, Carly, Mandy, or Joe, now would be a good time to go down to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type those in. And I'll ask the questions from Teresa. Has the question, how is the liability waiver different from a hold harmless agreement?
Yeah, so generally they're the same. It's liability waivers are also called hold harmless agreements. They're also referred to as exculpatory provisions or exculpatory contracts. And it's all the same thing, that it would hold harmless an event, someone putting on an event from liability for negligence claim.
Okay, James, Eric asked, would a click wrap serve as sufficient signature in the ticket purchasing process?
Yes, so click wrap refers to an electronic signature process. So you see this a lot, on a website where you accept their terms and conditions. And that has pretty widely been seen to be an enforceable contract. Again, with any implementation of a liability waiver, you want to make sure, and especially in the electronic form, you want to make sure that it intelligently informs the signer of what's being waived. So when you're using click wrap, I would recommend bolding the term right by the checkbox that says, I understand the terms above and agree to waive my right to bring in a negligence claim, or something similar that would inform the signer of the significance of the quick wrap acceptance.
James Aaron asked, how do waivers apply to volunteers as opposed to employees?
Yeah, that would depend generally. First off, I would say it can vary by jurisdiction. The law that I've seen generally allows for waivers for volunteers. That would be effective in the volunteer context to insulate you from liability. Employment just implicates a whole different set of laws. So any liability in the employment context is generally governed by workmen's compensation laws and other regulations. So that's one reason why a liability waiver would be ineffective in that context. But as it pertains to volunteers, we generally find that they have been effective.
Okay. And Sarah asked, what are best practices for waivers when one person might be purchasing tickets for multiple people, or other situations where you might not have contact with some attendees before they arrive at your event? Can one person waive rights for a group?
Yeah, so generally the right has to be waived by each individual. So, I would say in that context, implementing some sort of procedure where you are informing the purchaser or ticket holders before the event, and then maybe also having them, maybe informing them prior to the event that you're going to be asking them to sign a waiver, and then at the time of the event having them sign it there, just so that the choice is freely and intelligently made.
Okay, Alonzo asks, is there any specific guidance to liability waivers involving children, schools, after-school programs?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with waivers in that context. That sort of activity would be more likely to implicate the public policy law that I was talking about earlier. Anytime you're talking about an essential service like education or childcare, you run the risk of less enforceability for your waiver. So a waiver is going to be much more enforceable in the context of a voluntary activity like skydiving or something like that than it would be for an essential or any leisure activity than it would be for an essential activity like childcare or something like that. So I would really have to look into that one further before I could provide and look at the specific circumstances before I could provide a good opinion on that.
If you're hiring artists, actors, designers, does their signed contract need to include this language as well?
Yeah, I think that would be a lot more likely to implicate the employment prohibition that I mentioned. So you would have to really look at the circumstances of that. But generally, I'm not sure how enforceable they would be in that context where you're hiring someone to do that.
So Sue asks, would you explain how an organization's insurance interacts with a waiver?
Sure. That's a great question. So, and one good step that your organization can take in addition to employing a liability waiver is to make sure that your insurance policy covers liability pertaining to COVID-19. I don't think one precludes the other, but if you want to do a belt and suspenders approach, you should absolutely make sure your insurance coverage covers liability pertaining to pathogens or COVID-19 transmission, and also that you're employing a liability waiver that will be enforceable.
We have a question from Barbara. Is it enforceable if we were to put in the liability waiver a prohibition from anyone trashing our organization on social media or going public if they got COVID after coming to an event?
No, I don't think that sort of thing would generally be enforceable. I think your recourse in that situation, because you wouldn't really be waiving a legal right in that situation. I think your recourse there would be something to the effect of a defamation suit or something of that nature. But I'm not aware of any situation where you could, in this context, where you could prohibit someone from speaking freely about their experience.
And Brian asks, can acceptance of terms and conditions of a ticket purchase include the waiver, or does it have to be a separate form?
Can acceptance of the terms and conditions? Yes, and again, this would depend on exactly how it is employed, but generally, yes, if you included a provision in your terms and conditions, it as a general matter, would be likely to be enforceable, again, provided that you met the legal requirements that I laid out earlier about, clear and unambiguous language and a free, intelligent waiver.
And would the potential risk of liability change once effective COVID-19 vaccines become widely available?
Yeah. So yes, I think so. You're always at risk of liability just by nature of operating. So I think the fact of a vaccine will make the prospect of exposure for this sort of thing less likely. I don't think that it will eliminate it whatsoever. And this is still a really new area in the law, so we're not sure, if we're not sure if these suits are going to, open the floodgates, if we're going to see a lot of them or not. There's a consensus that any lawsuit is going to be very hard to prove. But for things like causation, how do you prove that you got it, at school and not at the event you attended, or vice versa? One good thing about a waiver is that it helps at an early stage of a lawsuit to minimize exposure for your organization. And I think once a vaccine is available, that we'll likely see a drop off in suits related to this.
Teresa asks, can parents sign waivers for their children attending an arts camp?
Yeah, that is really jurisdictionally dependent. Some states allow that, some states do not. And it would really depend on the exact circumstances of, the camp and where it was operating. So I can't really opine one way or the other on that without, examining the specific situation.
And Robert asks, considers their actors to be self-employed. How would that affect the effectiveness of waivers?
Yeah, I don't have much experience in the employment arena. I'm not really qualified to answer that question. I think, generally in the employment context, these have been unenforceable. I'm not sure in that situation one way or the other. I would recommend, for that question, I would recommend posing that to someone with experience in employment law.
And we have a question from Lawrence asking if we'll have access to a recording of the webinar. And yes, everybody will get access to the webinar, a transcript of the webinar, additional resources within a day or two. I have a question now for the panelists. How confident do you feel about your plan? From 1, not very confident, to 5, extremely confident. Also, how often do you revisit your plan and make edits? This is for Carly, Mandy, and Joe.
So I would say confidence in the plan, if executed as written, is a 5, very high. What's yet to be seen, because we haven't opened yet, we haven't had any events yet, is in practice how it really works. So for example, we have a few very small weddings in October that 50 people or less. They're planned in a distanced manner, but what happens if they show up and aren't wearing their masks, or, are dancing really closely, or, all of those kinds of what ifs, no matter how many conversations we have leading up to it. the plan as written looks like it makes sense and will be safe, but what happens in practice still makes me nervous. As far as how often we make edits, we consider our plan a living document, and we deploy it to our staff and volunteers probably about once a month with any changes or updates called out in it, so that they realize that it's an updated version and can quickly skim through and find what we've changed.
Yeah, I would also say a 5. I feel very confident in our plans. I think they've been very well informed. We've been working hard to educate our audiences and also model the behavior we wish to see from our audiences. In execution, I would say that we're doing like 4.5 out of 5. Our indoor area, indoor cinema, is easily a 5. People have been complying with all of the requests for precautions. As for our outdoor location, I'd say people are a little, if they don't have a super clear understanding of what 6 feet is, that it's easy for one guest to make another feel slightly uncomfortable by the amount of distance between them. But again, that's something that we can model and encourage, but it's not something that we're walking around enforcing. As for how often we revisit them, right now we've revisited any time that the city changes their plans. So just recently on Friday, Columbia and Boone County came out with new health orders that close all entertainment, bars, and restaurants at 10 p.m. with the last call being 9 p.m. And so all of our late night screenings that started even just at 9 all had to be canceled. And so we've been making edits and adopting that as we go. One thing we've been keeping in mind a lot when communicating with our staff and audiences is the concept of like pandemic fatigue. I'll drop a thing in the resource in the chat for everybody, but it's something to just be mindful of as we are continuing to communicate what are the priority precautions that we're taking and want to really drive home, and what are the other precautions that people may start to forget or feel like are less important, and how can we continue to educate our audiences and our staff to engage in those practices.
And I feel somewhat confident in ours because we're kind of a plan within a plan. We have a plan, and we're going to be operating at a Kranzberg space, and they have a plan, so we're kind of double-barreled. In terms of changes, we're going to be going to the city to get approval. At this point in St. Louis, they've approved, with their customary restrictions, restaurants, cabaret spaces. They're looking long-term at larger venues for the future, but they have not approved a indoor arts activity, theater or dance or something like that. So we're all going to be on new ground here, and we're going to be open to their comments and criticism of our plans for that.
Are any of the panelists implementing waivers?
So I have learned a lot from James. We are implementing some forms of waivers, but it sounds like we have some improvement to do. We do have some terms and conditions that we ask people to accept when they book their tickets online. We also have added some language into our event contracts to hold us harmless. And then we did have a acknowledgement of our plan when we deployed that to our staff and volunteers, signing that they read and understood the plan, that they would follow the plan, and to some degree, hold the museum harmless. So those are kind of 3 ways that we've used them.
We have not implemented any waivers for our indoor cinema space. When we hosted a drive-in a couple weeks ago, it was encompassed with a few stops along the way, some roadside surprises. And so we did include a waiver. Our lawyer added a clause about COVID. We do not currently have any kind of waiver or hold harmless agreement when purchasing a ticket or when entering the space at our cinema or anything like that. It is something we're evaluating with our organization's lawyer right now, but it's not something that we have implemented for our daily operations.
We have asked everybody who's working on this show with us to go through the Missouri ArtsSafe thing, view the video, and register there. So I know that's not a waiver, but at least they're plugged in to that extent. But we will be exploring it. I think we're going to try to do a reservations only, touchless theater entry where no one just shows up. So hopefully everyone will be going through the ticket process, and we're going to explore what we can or what we should do there.
We have a question. Many not-for-profits have very limited resources. Many are effectively judgment-proof. Does an organization's board of directors have exposure both collectively and individually?
Yeah, so that depends on a lot of circumstances. It depends on, the way that the organization is organized. Generally, in limited liability corporation or other forms of corporate organizations, there's not, exposure for, well, it depends. This is a really tough question to answer without knowing some more specifics here. I would say too, the other thing is that there's always, you can be sued for anything. It's just about, effectively managing risk and employing, good conduct to minimize that risk. So.
Okay. We don't have any questions in the queue at this moment, so I'd like to let everyone know that we've got additional webinars coming up. On September 16th, there will be a webinar, same time, on staff health and wellness. September 30th, there will be one on de-escalation, and particularly we're thinking of interactions with the public, which may require some de-escalation techniques. And on October 14th, there will be one on public relations. I also want to encourage groups, if you haven't already, go to MissouriArtsSafe.org and learn about the process of getting registered, how to get to training, what the certification process involves, what the universal measures are, and also look at the 28 organizations that are already certified and already linked there. This is for the public to know that you're making measures to create safely, present safely, and attend safely. And I think that's an important part of this process. Also, following up this webinar, you'll get within a day or two recording and transcription of this webinar, links and handouts that we think will be useful to you. And this will also be saved on the MissouriArtsSafe.org website. So you'll receive that in an email within a day or two. And I want to thank our panelists, Carly Love, Mandy Stone, Joe Hanrahan, for their expertise and experience in presenting their own plans, and also James Emanuel for your legal advice and help helping us with our waiver questions. Thank you all, and please come back and go to the website and ask questions there if you have them.